Recently, I did 3 consulting calls with engineers who use AutoCAD in their drafting workflow. Different disciplines, different type of work. And all 3 of them came in thinking they knew what their problem was. One thought he needed better tools. Another one thought he needed automation. The other one thought he needed AI. And all 3 were wrong. If they would have just gone about and fixing what they thought was the problem, they would have wasted time, money, and still been stuck. So, in this video, I'm going to walk you through those 3 real calls, what they thought the problem was, what the real actual bottleneck was, and where they sat on the CAD ladder. Because chances are one of these is going to sound very familiar to you. Quick context, I have been using AutoCAD for 8 years in engineering environments. And now, through Vistrux, I help engineering firms and drafting teams draft faster by fixing the system underneath the drawings, from standards, dynamic blocks, sheet set manager, and then automation when they're actually ready for it. And one thing I keep seeing again and again is this: there's a ladder. At the bottom, you have got messy CAD. Then you'd have CAD standards. Then the step above that is dynamic blocks. The step above that is sheet set manager. And then above that is AI and automation. And at the top is what I call the super drafty. Let me just explain all of that. At the bottom, you have got messy CAD. That's where the workflow depends too much on the individual. Jacob does things one way, Maria does it another. Layers are inconsistent, plotting styles are inconsistent, viewport setups vary, and files behave differently depending on who touched them. So instead of having a system, you have got personal habits. Now, above that, you have got CAD standards. This is where the team gets on the same page. It stops being Jacob's way or Maria's way and become the company's way. Same layers, same plotting styles, same naming rules, and same drafting approach. The goal here is consistency. So the output is reliable no matter who works on it. Then comes dynamic blocks. Once these standards are in place, the next step is reducing the repetitive drafting work. Without dynamic blocks, teams usually end up with the huge static libraries. One block for every small variation. That gets messy very quickly and becomes hard to maintain. Dynamic blocks solve that by making one block flexible enough to handle multiple situations. And this also becomes really important later because automation works much better when it can call pre-engineered blocks instead of trying to create everything from scratch. Then comes Sheet Set Manager. This is where you bring the Sheet Set Manager into play. I place this after dynamic blocks because it's a bigger workflow shift for most teams. If you try to change too much too early, adoption gets harder. Once people are already working in a cleaner, more standardized way, Sheetset Manager becomes much easier to introduce. Above that, you have got automation and AI skills. This is where you start using automation properly. Not on top of chaos, but on top of a system that already makes sense. Automation works best when the repeatable parts have already been thought through. If your standards are clear, your blocks are pre engineered, your sheet workflow is structured, then AI has much less guesswork to do. That makes it faster, more reliable, and much more useful. And at the top, you have got what I call the super drafty. This is not just someone who drafts quickly. It is someone who works inside a system, improves that system, and uses leverage to multiply the output. They are not just faster themselves, they make the whole team faster. That's the real goal. Not just drafting more, but building a workflow that lets better output happen again and again. Now, with all this, most people try to jump straight to the top. They want AI, they want automation, they want the fancy stuff. But if the levels below are not solid, none of it holds. You cannot automate a mess. And that's exactly what kept showing up in these calls. The first call, what I want to discuss, is about the engineer who thought he needed better tools. So he worked in the building services industry. He was in structure or civil, but he used AutoCAD as part of his documentation workflow. And he came in with a very specific problem. His drawings were not behaving properly. The X references were completely off, things were not attaching properly, outputs were inconsistent. And because there's so much noise about AI and automation, and because there's so much noise about AI, automation, and agentic workflows, he was starting to wonder whether the solution was something more advanced, something smarter, something more sophisticated. But when I looked at his setup, the problem wasn't X references or anything. Problem wasn't tools at all. His workflow foundation was actually broken. The basics were off, the template was not set up properly, the layer standards were inconsistent, plot settings was all over the place. There was no proper skeleton holding all of it together. And when the foundation is broken, everything starts behaving strangely. Your X references feel unreliable, your plots are inconsistent, random things break for absolutely no reason. So you end up chasing symptoms instead of the actual cause. So, what did we do? We dropped the noise around AI and automation. We rebuilt the setup properly. Template, layer standards, annotation scales, plot styles, the whole lot. And once that foundation was cleaned up, the weird behavior stopped happening. The XREF issues were gone, plotting became more consistent, plotting became predictable, and suddenly the daily friction he had normalized just disappeared. On the ladder, he was at the bottom, messy CAD, but he was trying to jump straight to the top. And that's the mistake. If your setup is unpredictable, if you're constantly fighting small fires, if AutoCAD always feels like it's doing something weird, ask yourself honestly, is the software the actual problem? Or have you been working with a broken setup for so long that it feels normal? Because if it's the second one, you do not need more tools. You need to go back to the step you skipped. So the next one is where the senior engineer thought he needed automation. This one was a senior structure engineer who had a drafting team under him, and his ask was very clear. He wanted automation. As you know, I love these type of people. Anyway, he had heard about AI, automation, just like everyone else, and he had an idea of what could be actually possible and wanted to know how to bring it to his own firm, which on the surface is a great question. So I started to ask him about his workflow. How does the drawing move from the start to the end? Where does the handoff take place? What is actually slowing you down? Where does the rework happen? And what are the individual activities? How is the drawing being produced? And that's where it got interesting because he couldn't really tell me. Not because he was trying to hide or anything, it's because he did not have that insight into what his team was actually doing. He just didn't have the visibility into how the work actually moved through the team. He knew the drawings went in one end and came out on the other. But what happened in between? Where were the delays? Why was rework happening? Which tasks were genuinely repetitive? Which parts were inconsistent from drafter to drafter? That part wasn't clear. And I said to him, if you can't describe your own workflow, how is AI supposed to automate it? Because AI does not create your process, it accelerates the process you already have. If that process is unclear, inconsistent, or invisible, AI just makes your chaos faster. So, what he actually needed was not automation. He needed visibility. He needed to understand how work moved through the team, where the bottlenecks really were, where the standards broke down, and what part of the workflow is worth improving first. And on the ladder, this firm was actually on an interesting part. They were not at the bottom, they actually had CAD standards. They also had few dynamic blocks, but not extensive enough. These standards existed more on paper and not in practice. Different drafters were doing different things slightly differently. The blocks were there, but basic, not really used to its full potential. So they were in two different steps and not owning any of them. And they didn't have a sheet set manager. Like I said, so it's best for most firms to fix these two steps before getting into sheet set manager, because that would dramatically make a difference in their workflow. And people hate changes. So their next move should be, first, get the standards consistent across the team. Second, upgrade the dynamic blocks. Bring in the sheet set manager. Then we can talk about AI and automation. And if you're a senior engineer, principal, or a team lead listening to this, and you're thinking about AI and automation, this is exactly why you need to know where your team actually sits on the ladder. Not where you hope they are, but actually where they are. Because if your steps below are not solid, you are just adding an expensive chaos on top of it. Because if your steps are not solid, adding AI on top of it just adds expensive chaos. And if you're listening to this and thinking, I don't know where my team sits on the ladder either, that is exactly the kind of thing that I help with in the CAD Clarity call. Next is my third call, the engineer who thought he needed AI to get better. And this one is probably the most relatable one. This guy worked in a systems heavy discipline within the building technology space. Very technical, very detail oriented guy, uses AutoCAD regularly. And he came in wanting two things. One, how to draw faster in AutoCAD, and to understand how AI could fit into his workflow. Both completely reasonable. So we started by walking through his day-to-day workflow, how he basically works. I was not looking for anything dramatic. I just wanted to know where I could use maybe AI or something in his workflow. I was just trying to understand the real workflow before talking about where AI might actually fit. And that's when I started noticing these small things, not big structural problems, just habits. The way he moved through commands, how he handled repetitive drafting tasks, a few steps that were adding unnecessary friction. Little things that he had been doing for years, not because they were the best way, but because that's how he has always done it. Now, here's a problem jumping straight into AI. AI would have inherited all those inefficiencies. You could just get a faster version of a broken habit. And that is not progress. So we did not start with AI. We cleaned up specific habits first, just one or two targeted fixes. Nothing dramatic, no huge overhauls. Just a better drafting system underneath. And the improvement was immediate. Faster drawings, cleaner output, less friction. Now, on the ladder, he's actually on a good place, I'd say. They really had their CAD standards dialed down, but did not have a dynamic block library. So his next step would be dynamic blocks. Not AI, not automation. Dynamic blocks. Because that's what would give him the next real lift in speed and consistency. And once that layer is in place properly, then the conversation about AI starts to make sense. So if your CAD standards are solid, great. Your next step might not be general productivity hacks. It might simply be building the right dynamic blocks for the kind of work you do every day. So here's the pattern across all those three codes. Every one of those engineers was smart. Every one of them was capable. And every one of them had a genuine problem. But all three of them were solving for the symptom, but not the actual cause. That's the pattern I keep seeing. And I think the reason is simple. When you are inside your own workflow every day, you stop seeing it clearly. You notice the friction, you feel the stress, you know something is off. But the step that actually needs fixing is often lower down the ladder than you think. So you start looking into an AI solution, automation solution, or productivity solution when the real bottleneck is standards, dynamic blocks, sheet set manager, or simply the visibility into how the work is actually happening. That's the blind spot. And that's exactly what the CAD Clarity Call is for. If any part of these stories sounded familiar to you, you can book a CAD Clarity Call with me using the link below. Inside that call, you'll get three things. First, I will identify the real bottleneck in your current workflow. Second, I will give you three practical recommendations based on your actual setup. Third, you will get a custom report tailored to your work with a clear recommendation on what your next step should be. So, if you're feeling stuck, if AutoCAD feels messy, if your team is inconsistent, or if you're not sure whether your next step is standards, dynamic blocks, or sheet set manager, or automation, book the CAD clarity call below. Stop guessing, get clear on what to fix next. And if this kind of content feels useful to you, hit that subscribe button. On this channel, I talk about agentic CAD automations and how you can go from messy CAD workflows to dynamic blocks to sheet set manager and all the way to AI and automation.